guys. So today we're going to build a tool that's going to serve you well for as long as you're building your bus and anything else. And what it is a saw guide. This allows you to cut down bigger sheet material with much more precision and safety. When you're ripping, for example, which is when you're cutting the long way down a sheet of plywood, it's very hard to stay on a line and to cut a very straight line. And that's where these things come into play. You simply take one of these, you clamp it on there, and it guides the blade in a perfectly straight line to wherever you want the length to be. Now these are pretty easy to make. The pieces we're going to need is two 8-foot 1x4s, and then you're going to need the screws that are about 1.5 inches, or if you can find something that's 1 3/8, that would be about perfect. You need them to go through 2 thicknesses of these 1x4s and not poke out the other side. Because if they poke out the other side, it's going to be a problem. They're going to be showing on the side that we want to put as our guide down onto the material. That would be poking out this side, which is bad. Don't do that. Find shorter screws. So today, the reason I am even doing this, again, as you can see, I have 2 of them here. The main thing is one of them, the first one I ever made was this one. It's only about 36 inches long, which is fine if you're doing short stuff. But to be honest, this is pretty worthless. Don't make one of these that's this long. The second one is a little better. This one is 60 inches long. This allows me to do a cross cut across a regular 4x8 sheet, crosswise, all the way across and a little more. Now, for a long time, I've been meaning to make a long 8-foot one to do full-length cuts. That's what I'm going to make today and show you guys how I do it. So I'm going to build this the same way that you guys would. It's using the same tools that you would have to work with. Because obviously if you're making one of these, you probably don't have a table saw and you're trying to make your Skil saw do more. This is the first one I did. I did this one about 2 inches wide. That was probably as wide as you can possibly do it because it didn't leave me much room to be straight to cut the lining cut down the side. This one I only did about 1 inch wide. It works well, but having to do it over again now, I think I'm going to do it a little wider than that, especially being that this is going to be an 8-footer. So if you don't have a pile of these clamps, you're going to want to buy a half a dozen of these things. You're going to use them non-stop. Number one, you're going to need them for these you're going to need some clamps to use this tool. And number two, you're just going to find yourself clamping things all the time once you have them. Now, to set the saw to make this cut, this isn't super ideal in doing it this way. What I was planning on doing here didn't work very well. This is kind of the best thing I've come up with to do this without having any additional tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the saw depth so it cuts just the depth of the board. I'm not going to be able to cut it clean from one end to the other just because the clamps have to be on the ends, which since the guide board is actually going to be on this the outer face here that's touching this side, it won't make a big deal whether this cut is perfectly straight or not. The biggest thing here is being able to make the cut to make it the right length, or width rather. We're going for 1.5 inches in width. So I set this up where I have a clamp in the middle. I didn't clamp these super tight because obviously as this saw cuts by, it's going to create a pinch on the blade. As you can see, we set the depth of the saw to just a smidge over 3/4. We are going to have to make a plunge cut here, which is where we're going to set the saw up against the guide, lift it up, start the saw, set it down, and then we're going to start the cut. We're actually going to cut from about 2 inches from this end down to the other end, and we're going to stop a couple inches before the other end. We'll take the pieces out of here, we'll clamp them to the other board, and we'll do the final cuts on the ends to make sure we get the full length. See, once I went past that clamp, it didn't have anything to hang on to anymore because it was relatively loose, but just enough to hold this board tight, and it just ended up falling off on the floor. So as you can see, now we have it cut from a few inches on each end, and these are basically two flimsy little pieces of wood. So I'm going to set this up here. We're going to finish the cuts off of both ends, and then we can get ready to make this with the other piece. This one we're just going to freehand since it's only 1.5 inches. And there we go. We have our two pieces. Should be one at, I believe, 1.5 inches and one at 2. There we go. So the 2-inch, we're going to set that aside. We're not going to use that one. We're going to use the 1 inch or the 1.5 inches. We're going to take our board that we were using as our guide and get ready to mate these two together. And like I mentioned, you have to measure on your particular Skil saw what your clearance is from the guide to the blade. I know mine is 1.5 inches, so I'm going to set this up to make sure that I have at least 1.5 inches all the way along this length. I'm actually going to set this one at 1.75 inches. Almost made a mistake. When you make this, you have to make sure to pay attention to which side is the factory edge and which side is the one you just cut. Here, I actually had the wrong one facing the guide side. I want the factory edge of the board facing the guide side because that edge is going to be the straightest. Well, a lot straighter than I can cut. I'm going to want to check this in the middle too, because this being cut in half now may have relieved some stress in that board and have twisted it, which in my case is about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to have to pull this over and clamp it back into place. Because this is the important part, that all of this needs to be the same, or roughly the same. It's going to be aligned when we cut this aligning cut, but the closer it is to straight now, the better. What I've discovered here is that the underlying board I'm using is not very straight, and neither is the guide board. And starting out with something relatively straight is imperative because it's only going to be as straight as your alignment is to begin with. I happen to have a long straight edge here, and what I'm going to do is set the one end where I want it, and then set the other end where I want it in relation to the cut board, and then I'm just going to go along and align it manually until it lines up pretty straight. You could also do this with another sheet of plywood if you had a piece, that has a fresh cut edge on the side of it. That's probably going to be a little bit more dimensionally stable than some of this lumber is. Obviously, this probably has moved and become much more flexible since I cut it as well. If you don't have a square or a straight edge like this, you're definitely going to want to invest in one of those as well. Just being able to check and make sure that your work is actually straight is another pretty important piece of building just about anything. We got it straightened out here. I'm going to put one more clamp on it just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, and then we're going to put the screws in. I'm going to pre-drill these. It's up to you. You may or may not actually have to do this. Just make sure you set the stop so the drill doesn't go all the way through as well. Now let's see how it turned out. Looks good. Just checking to make sure none of the screws pop through the other side, since the ones I used are actually really close to the same thickness of the material we're working with. The next and last piece of this is we have to clamp it up one last time and make the aligning cut. Now this cut, you're going to want to take your time and make sure the saw stays nice and tight against the guide. This is going to be what makes or breaks this tool. If this is straight, everything's going to work perfect. It'll serve you for years and years. If this gets wonky and something goes wrong during this cut, we basically are going to need another board and we're going to start from scratch. If this does go sideways, make sure you just start with another board. For the $2 or $3 that it costs, make sure this tool is done right, because if it gets crooked, everything you cut with it forever is going to be crooked. So I'm going to start with as much of the saw engaged here as I can get, so we start off as straight as possible. There we go. Now we have a line as straight and long as we want to cut. It's not perfect, but I think it's as good as we're going to get. So hopefully you guys can make one of these on your own, and you can rip down sheets of plywood.